In a packed courtroom, a judge smirked as he mocked a black woman, completely unaware of who she really was. But when she reached into her pocket and revealed her badge, the entire room froze. What happens next will shock everyone. How will she turn the tables and fight for justice? Stay tuned to find out. And don't forget to subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. The air inside Cook County Courthouse felt heavy, thick with the kind of anticipation that clung to the walls like humidity before a storm. The wooden benches were packed with spectators, some watching with casual curiosity, others whispering among themselves. At the defense table, Danielle Carter sat with her back straight, her hands neatly folded in front of her. Her sharp, calculating eyes swept the courtroom, noting everything. The smug grin on the prosecutor's face, the subtle but unmistakable tension in the jury's expressions, and most importantly, the rigid posture of her younger brother, Malcolm Carter, sitting beside her. Malcolm's fingers gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles pale from the pressure. He had always been the strong one, the one who never backed down. But today, the weight of weeks of accusations had worn him down. The charge of assaulting a police officer hung over him like a noose, despite clear video evidence that contradicted the claim. Danielle reached over and gave his hand a gentle squeeze. "Breathe," she murmured. "The truth will come out. Just hold on." The heavy courtroom doors creaked open. Judge Richard Caldwell entered, his black robe billowing behind him. He was a man in his early 60s, his silver hair neatly combed back, his sharp nose giving him the look of someone who had spent years looking down on those before him. His reputation for biased rulings wasn't a rumor. It was a well-documented fact. "Court is now in session," the bailiff announced. Caldwell settled into his seat, adjusting his glasses as he scanned the room. His gaze lingered on Danielle, and for a brief second, the faintest smirk curled on his lips. "Let's get this over with," he muttered under his breath, but loud enough for the front rows to hear. Danielle didn't flinch. She had seen men like him before, men who judged her before she even spoke, men who saw her skin before they saw her credentials. But she remained still, her expression unreadable. Across the room, Prosecutor Eric Donahue stood, straightened his tie, and took a step forward. His voice carried a forced confidence. "Your Honor," he began, "the evidence is clear." The defendant exhibited a blatant disregard for law enforcement, and no amount of excuses will change that. Danielle's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Not yet. She was waiting for the right moment to strike. Danielle sat motionless, her face unreadable, as Prosecutor Eric Donahue continued his monologue, weaving a carefully rehearsed narrative that painted Malcolm as a violent criminal. "The officer in question," Donahue continued, "acted within the scope of his duty. The defendant resisted a lawful arrest, and the law is clear on the consequences of such actions." Danielle felt her stomach churn. Lawful? The video footage clearly showed the officer shoving Malcolm unprovoked, escalating the situation with excessive force over what should have been a routine traffic stop. And yet, here they were, Malcolm fighting for his freedom in a system designed to break him. Malcolm's lawyer, a young but visibly nervous defense attorney named Ryan Brooks, stood hesitantly. "Your Honor, if I may." Judge Caldwell cut him off before he could finish. "Get to the point, Mr. Brooks. We don't have all day." A few soft chuckles rippled through the gallery, but Danielle remained composed. She noted every condescending glance Caldwell shot toward the defense, every dismissive wave of his hand when Ryan attempted to object to Donahue's arguments. It wasn't just bias, it was a performance. The judge had already made up his mind. Danielle exchanged a brief look with Malcolm, His shoulders were tight, his jaw clenched. She could feel the frustration radiating off him, the helplessness in his eyes. "Relax," she whispered under her breath. "They want you angry. Don't give them that." Malcolm exhaled sharply but nodded. Judge Caldwell turned his attention to Danielle, his thin lips curling into a smirk. "Miss Carter," he drawled, "are you here to testify as a legal expert, or are we just going to hear another emotional appeal?" A few scattered murmurs filled the room. Danielle's expression remained neutral as she stood and stepped forward. "I'm here to present the truth, Your Honor," she said evenly. "Nothing more, nothing less." Caldwell scoffed, leaning back in his chair. "Truth?" he repeated with mock amusement. "And what exactly qualifies you to speak on matters of law enforcement? Or do you simply believe that watching a few courtroom dramas makes you an expert?" A few chuckles rippled through the gallery again. Danielle felt the heat rise in her chest, but she swallowed it down. She had been in far worse situations than this, negotiating high-stakes security details, facing down actual threats to national safety. She had spent years mastering control. She simply smiled. "With all due respect, Your Honor," she said, voice calm, but sharp enough to cut through the noise. "I have more first-hand experience with law enforcement procedures than you might think." Caldwell let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "Is that so?" he sneered. "Well then, Miss Carter, enlighten us." Danielle's fingers brushed against the badge inside her blazer pocket. She wasn't going to play his game. She was about to end it. Danielle took a slow, deliberate breath, steadying herself. Now was the moment. The courtroom had settled into a hushed anticipation. All eyes were on her. Judge Caldwell leaned back in his high-backed chair, tapping his gavel against the desk impatiently. "Well, Miss Carter," he drawled, "I'm waiting." Danielle lifted her chin slightly, exuding an unshakable confidence that made even the prosecutor, Eric Donahue, shift uncomfortably in his seat. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady and clear. "You asked what qualifies me to speak on law enforcement procedures." She reached into the inner pocket of her blazer, pulling out a small black wallet, the leather smooth from years of use. With practiced ease, she flipped it open, revealing the unmistakable glint of a United States Secret Service USSS badge. The reaction was instantaneous. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. A few people leaned forward, eyes widening in shock. Even the court stenographer hesitated, fingers hovering over her keyboard. But the most satisfying reaction came from Judge Caldwell. His smirk disappeared, his body visibly stiffening. The confidence that had dripped from his every word just moments ago evaporated, replaced by something almost foreign on his usually arrogant face: uncertainty. "What?" Caldwell cleared his throat. "What is this?" Danielle took a step closer, letting the badge catch the overhead light, making sure everyone in that room saw it. "My name is Special Agent Danielle Carter, United States Secret Service," she said coolly. "And I have spent the last 10 years upholding and enforcing the very laws you claim to represent." The room erupted in whispers, the hushed murmurs of disbelief spreading like wildfire. The prosecutor shifted uneasily, the realization dawning on him. He had just tried to discredit a federal agent. Caldwell's fingers curled around his gavel, gripping it like an anchor. "I fail to see how your employment history is relevant to this case," he said, though his voice lacked the usual force. Danielle smiled, a slow, knowing smile that sent another wave of tension rippling through the room. "Oh, it's very relevant, Your Honor," she replied, "because it means I understand law enforcement. It means I know how officers are supposed to conduct themselves." It means I can recognize when an officer has abused their power." Her words landed like a punch to the gut. Caldwell's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists on his bench. Danielle turned her gaze to the jury, her presence commanding. "I have reviewed the evidence. I have seen the video. I have watched, frame by frame, as an officer escalated a situation that should never have been violent. I have witnessed my brother, an unarmed man, be shoved to the ground, restrained, and falsely accused, all while remaining calm." She let the weight of her words settle, allowing the room to absorb the gravity of what she had just said. Then she turned back to Judge Caldwell. "And yet, Your Honor, you dismissed that evidence. You dismissed every attempt to bring the truth to light. You treated this case as if it were already decided before we even stepped into this courtroom." Caldwell's face turned red. Whether from anger or embarrassment, Danielle couldn't tell. He opened his mouth, likely to reassert control. But before he could, Danielle took one final step forward, lowering her voice just enough that the words sent a chill through the room. "I have spent years protecting the integrity of this country's justice system, and I will not stand by while a courtroom, your courtroom, disrespects it." Silence. Absolute silence. Judge Caldwell swallowed, his throat bobbing as he struggled for a response. He glanced toward the prosecutor, but Donahue looked just as lost, his face pale. Danielle straightened, her badge still visible for the entire courtroom to see. She had won this round, and she wasn't done yet. The weight of Danielle's words hung heavy in the air. No one spoke. The tension was palpable, thick like a fog rolling over the room. Judge Caldwell shifted uncomfortably, gripping the armrests of his chair as though they might steady him. For the first time that day, he looked uncertain. His once dismissive gaze now flickered between Danielle's Secret Service badge and the jury, as if desperately trying to regain control. Danielle took a slow step back, allowing her presence to linger, letting the realization sink in, not just for the judge, but for everyone watching. It was the prosecutor, Eric Donahue, who finally found his voice, though it wavered slightly. "Your Honor," he said, standing up, "while Agent Carter's credentials are impressive, they do not change the facts of this case." He tried to regain his earlier confidence, adjusting his tie and turning toward the jury. "At the heart of this case is the simple fact that the defendant, Malcolm Carter, resisted arrest. Video evidence or not, we must ask ourselves, why would a trained officer use force unless provoked?" Danielle's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. She didn't need to, because the jury was already watching the video again. The defense attorney, Ryan Brooks, emboldened by Danielle's presence, stood and spoke with newfound authority. "Your Honor," he said, his voice stronger than before, "given the circumstances, I request that we replay the video for the jury." Judge Caldwell hesitated. He was cornered. If he denied the request, it would be seen as a deliberate act of bias. Finally, he let out a sharp breath and waved his hand. "Fine. Play the video." The courtroom projector flickered to life, displaying the grainy yet damning footage on the large screen. The jury watched in silence as the events unfolded once more. Malcolm, standing by his car, calm, cooperative. The officer shoving him. Malcolm raising his hands. The officer escalating. The takedown. The force. The unnecessary aggression. A woman in the jury shifted uncomfortably, her arms crossing over her chest. A man in the front row exhaled sharply, shaking his head. The truth was sinking in. When the video ended, the room remained eerily silent. Ryan Brooks turned back to Judge Caldwell. "Your Honor, the prosecution argues that Malcolm Carter resisted arrest. What this video shows is the opposite. An officer escalating a situation. an abuse of power, and an innocent man suffering for it. Danielle's eyes never left the judge. Caldwell clenched his jaw, but he couldn't ignore what everyone had just seen. His power was slipping, and for the first time he knew it. A heavy silence fell over the courtroom, the kind of silence that weighed on the air, thick with unspoken tension. Every single jury member sat motionless, the video replay still fresh in their minds. At the defense table, Malcolm Carter exhaled, his fingers still gripping the wood, as if letting go might send him spiraling. Danielle placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "Steady," she whispered. "It's almost over." Across the room, Judge Caldwell had gone rigid, his knuckles white where they clutched his gavel. He cleared his throat, attempting to regain the authority that had slowly been slipping from his grasp. "The jury will now deliberate," he said stiffly. "Court is adjourned until a verdict is reached." He struck his gavel against the bench, but it lacked the usual finality. It sounded hollow, weak. The jury filed out, leaving the courtroom buzzing with murmurs. Spectators whispered in hushed voices, reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads, and Eric Donahue, the prosecutor, looked visibly shaken. Danielle turned to Malcolm, squeezing his hand. "They saw the truth," she said softly. "Now we wait." The wait was excruciating. Minutes stretched into hours, the clock on the courtroom wall ticking like a slow drumbeat. Malcolm paced in the hallway, while Danielle remained still, her expression unreadable. She had been in far more tense situations, undercover operations, high-stakes interrogations, but nothing felt quite as personal as this. Finally, the doors creaked open. A bailiff stepped inside. "The jury has reached a verdict." The words sent a shiver through Malcolm. He swallowed hard, casting a glance at his sister. Danielle simply nodded, silently telling him to stand tall. Everyone took their seats, the jury filing back into the courtroom. The forewoman, a woman in her late 50s, with streaks of gray in her dark hair, stood with a folded piece of paper in her hands. She cleared her throat. "Your Honor, the jury has reached a unanimous decision." Caldwell nodded stiffly. "Proceed." The forewoman unfolded the paper, her eyes scanning the words before she spoke. "On the charge of resisting arrest, we find the defendant, Malcolm Carter." A beat of silence. "Not guilty." The words rippled through the courtroom like an earthquake. Gasps, whispers, a rush of noise as the weight of the decision settled over everyone. Malcolm sagged in relief, his shoulders trembling. Danielle, always composed, allowed herself a small smile before gripping his hand. Judge Caldwell's jaw tightened, his lips pressing into a thin line. The ruling had humiliated him, but he had no choice. "The defendant is free to go," he said curtly, forcing the words out, as though they physically pained him. "Court is adjourned." He slammed his gavel one last time and stormed out, his robe billowing behind him. Danielle turned to Malcolm, watching as tears welled in his eyes. "We did it," he whispered. Danielle shook her head. "Number. The truth did." The heavy doors of Cook County Courthouse swung open, and Danielle Carter stepped out into the crisp Chicago air, her brother Malcolm at her side. The moment their feet touched the courthouse steps, a wave of noise hit them. Reporters, activists, and onlookers, all waiting for a statement. "Malcolm, how do you feel about the verdict?" "Agent Carter, do you believe justice was truly served today?" Microphones were shoved forward, cameras flashed, and voices blended into a chaotic hum. But Danielle ignored them, keeping her attention solely on Malcolm, who still looked like he hadn't fully processed his own freedom. He turned to her, his voice barely above a whisper. "Angie, what now?" Danielle gave him a knowing look. "Now," she exhaled. "Now we don't stop." Malcolm frowned. We won. We won this battle. She met his gaze, her expression unwavering. But how many more people have been in the courtroom, sitting where you sat, and didn't have someone like me to fight for them? His jaw tightened, realization dawning. She wasn't just fighting for him. She was fighting for something bigger. Just then, a reporter broke through the crowd. Agent Carter, what's your next move? Danielle paused, glancing at Malcolm before turning back to face the press. Today, justice was served, she said, her voice carrying over the crowd. But justice should not be a privilege. It should be a guarantee. This fight isn't just about Malcolm Carter. It's about every individual who has been failed by a broken system. Murmurs rippled through the reporters. Cameras zoomed in. Danielle stepped forward, her voice strong, unwavering. And I intend to keep fighting. She turned, signaling to Malcolm that it was time to leave. He followed, still shaken. But something in him had changed. He had spent weeks drowning in helplessness, but now he saw a path forward. As they reached the car, Malcolm stopped and looked at her. You think we can really change things? Danielle gave him a small, rare smile. We already did. The courthouse loomed behind them, a symbol of both justice and injustice. But as they drove away, Malcolm knew one thing. This was just the beginning. The story of Danielle Carter and Malcolm Carter is more than just a courtroom drama. It's a powerful reminder of the importance of standing up for justice, knowing your rights, and challenging systemic bias. One of the biggest takeaways from this story is that the truth alone is not always enough to ensure justice. If Danielle had not used her experience, confidence, and authority, Malcolm could have been another victim of a flawed system. This teaches us that advocacy and knowledge are crucial tools in fighting injustice. So, how can we apply this to real life? Know your rights. Whether dealing with law enforcement or the legal system, understanding your rights is essential. Ignorance can be exploited, but knowledge is power. Speak up against injustice. Staying silent in the face of discrimination allows it to continue. Even if you are not directly affected, be an ally for those who are. Use your influence. Danielle didn't just have the truth. She had the credentials to demand respect. Whatever your field, use your expertise to create change. This story reminds us that justice is not automatic. It must be fought for. But with persistence, knowledge, and courage, we can challenge unfair systems and create a fairer world for everyone. When faced with a biased system, what would you do? Would you fight to the end, using logic and determination to demand justice, 1. Or stay silent, accepting your fate to avoid trouble and risks, 2. Drop a comment with 1 or 2 below and share your thoughts. I'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and support the channel so we can keep spreading these important messages.